The Curse of La Siguanaba, the woman who devoured souls. Based on real stories. Arrival in Guatemala. The heavy, humid air of Guatemala hit Ethan Morgan like an invisible wall as he exited La Aurora International Airport. Adjusting the camera strap on his shoulder, he watched the organized chaos of the city stretching into the distance, framed by dormant volcanoes that seemed to survey the landscape with ancient indifference. At age 35, with 3 award-winning documentaries to his credit and a growing reputation on the independent circuit, Ethan had come looking for something that could define his career: the definitive documentation of the legend of the Siguanaba, the female spirit who seduced unfaithful men only to reveal her monstrous face before driving them mad or to their death. What he would not admit, not even to himself, was that something beyond professional interest had brought him to this country. Something more personal, darker. "Senor Morgan, this way." A voice cut into his thoughts as a middle-aged man with a warm smile approached, hand outstretched. "I'm Miguel Fuentes, your guide and translator. Welcome to Guatemala." Beside him, a young woman with black hair tied into a practical bun and a compact man carrying professional filming equipment. "This is Sofia Mendez, your local production assistant, and Carlos Vega, our cameraman. We are all very excited about your project about our legends." Before Ethan could respond properly, his phone vibrated. The name Claire flashed on the screen, making her stomach tighten. Asking for a moment, he took a few steps away. "Hi, Claire." His wife's voice sounded distant, not just because of the thousands of kilometers that physically separated them. "Did you get there okay?" The conversation proceeded with the uncomfortable familiarity of a slowly unraveling marriage. Practical questions, short answers, and an underlying tension that neither was ready to directly confront. "I need to go now. I'll call in a few days," he finally said, hanging up before she could fully respond. As Miguel's Jeep cut through the chaotic traffic of Guatemala City, Ethan observed the stark contrast between the modern buildings and the slums clinging to the hillsides between the luxury stores and street vendors. It was a city of extremes, of vivid contradictions, the perfect setting for a legend about deceptive appearances. As they left the urban center, heading to the first village on their filming schedule, Sofia provided information about the region and the prevalence of belief in supernatural beings. "Siguanaba isn't just a story to us," she explained, her dark eyes meeting his in the rearview mirror. "Many people here swore they had seen her. Some were never the same afterward." As they passed a rural intersection, an elderly man sitting on the side of the road made a quick and strange gesture upon seeing the vehicle, fingers forming a small cross that he pressed against his chest. Miguel muttered something in Spanish too low for Ethan to hear. "What did he say?" asked the documentary filmmaker, noting how the mood in the vehicle had suddenly changed. Carlos and Sofia exchanged looks. It was Miguel who finally responded, his voice deliberately casual. He asked for protection. He said, "We saw a woman in a white dress standing exactly at this intersection last night. Local superstitions, nothing more." But the way his hand tightened on the steering wheel told a different story. At that moment, Ethan's phone vibrated again. It wasn't Claire this time, but a message from a local number he had saved simply as L. "I can't wait to see you tonight, I missed you." Quickly closing the message, Ethan looked out the window at the distant mountains, where dark clouds were forming like an omen. Something told him that local superstitions might be more real than he was willing to admit. The village of San Juan Comalapa seemed frozen in time. its colorful adobe houses scattered across the mountainside like confetti thrown by a giant's hand. After 3 hours of traveling along winding roads that wound between deep valleys and dizzying ravines, the team had finally reached their first important destination, in the center of the small square, where children played football with a worn-out ball, and women sold vibrant fabrics to the rare tourists. Miguel pointed to a modest house at the end of a cobblestone street. Don Fernando is waiting for us there. He is 92 years old and is considered the greatest living authority on the legends of this region. His family has been documenting local stories for generations. As they walked, Ethan noticed how the locals looked at their cameras with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, some making that same protective gesture he had seen earlier. The sky, once clear, was now filled with low clouds that seemed to press the village against the mountain. Don Fernando's house smelled of dried herbs, old wood, and wax candles. In the center of the main room, lit only by natural light filtered through small windows and a few flickering candles, sat a fragile-looking man, but with intense black eyes that contrasted with his snow-white hair. His hands, gnarled and marked by time, rested on a dark, leather-bound book that looked as old as its owner. "Welcome," he said in surprisingly clear, if heavily accented English. "Come and sit down. You want to see La Siguanaba." It wasn't a question, but a statement, as if he already knew exactly why they were there. While Carlos prepared the filming equipment and Sofia organized her notebook, Don Fernando opened the old book, revealing yellowed pages filled with handwritten text and detailed drawings. La Siguanaba, he began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a seasoned storyteller, was originally known as Siguanet, a woman of extraordinary beauty who lived in ancient times when the gods walked among bay. Asmo. His trembling fingers turned a page, revealing a drawing of a stunning woman. She was married to a respected warrior and had a young son. But Siguanet was unfaithful. She cheated on her husband with many men and neglected her son to meet his lovers. As he spoke, the wind began to pick up outside, making the house's windows vibrate gently. The goddess Tlaloc, furious at her conduct and especially at her neglect of the child, cursed Siguanet to wander eternally like La Siguanaba, condemned to first show herself as an irresistibly beautiful woman to attract unfaithful and reckless men only to later reveal her true form. Don Fernando turned another page, and Ethan felt his blood run cold. The drawing showed a grotesque figure, with the body of a woman, but with a head that mixed equine features and a human skull. Flaming, red eyes, long, sharp teeth protruding from an elongated skull, and an expression of pure malevolence that seemed to leap off the page. "This is the true face of La Siguanaba," the elder explained, carefully watching Ethan's reaction. "Some say she has a horse's head, others that it is a rotting skull, but all agree that to look at her true face is to look into the abyss, a horror so profound that the human mind cannot fully process it." Carlos's camera whirred softly as he focused on the drawing, capturing every unsettling detail. "My own brother Eduardo found her," Don Fernando continued, his voice now lower as if he feared being overheard by unwanted ears. It was 1962. He was young, strong, had a wife and 2 young children. But Eduardo also had a lover in the neighboring city. The old man sighed deeply, the weight of memory visible on his wrinkled face. One night, returning from a meeting with this woman, he saw a female figure washing clothes by the river. It was late, dangerous for a woman to be alone, so he stopped to offer help. Don Fernando closed his eyes for a moment, as if visualizing the scene. She turned around and Eduardo said he had never seen such a beautiful woman. Perfect skin, waist-length black hair, a smile that made his heart stop. He offered her a ride and she accepted. The elder's voice trembled slightly. What happened next? Eduardo could never describe it coherently. He was found the next morning miles from the car, his shoes destroyed from running, clothes torn, eyes wide with pure terror. He just kept repeating, "The face. The face wasn't a face." The room seemed to grow darker as Don Fernando spoke, as if the shadows themselves were moving closer to listen. Eduardo was never the same. He didn't sleep, he barely ate. 3 weeks later, he hanged himself. In the note, he simply wrote, "She's coming to get me anyway." A heavy silence fell over the room as Don Fernando finished his report. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling between the village's buildings like a distant lament. Carlos had stopped filming and was looking nervously at the window. Sophia wrote frantically, but her hands were visibly shaking. It was Ethan who finally broke the silence. "What specific places does she usually appear?" Don Fernando slowly closed the old book, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. La Siguanaba prefers places of transition, where land meets water, where roads intersect, where civilization meets wild nature. Isolated ravines, rivers at dusk, country road crossings after sunset. Places where you can easily get lost. He paused significantly. But perhaps the most important question is not where it appears, but to whom. His black eyes bored into Ethan with disturbing intensity. There are signs, you understand, that someone has been chosen by her. Vivid dreams about a woman who never shows her face. Long black hair found in clothes without explanation. Reflections in mirrors and water that don't exactly match what was expected. And most significantly, an inexplicable compulsion to go out alone at night, as if something was calling him. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as the phone in his pocket vibrated silently. Another message, probably from Lucia. Avoiding, checking in front of others, he returned his attention to Don Fernando. "How can anyone protect themselves?" he asked, trying to keep his voice professional, although something in his tone betrayed a more personal concern. The old man leaned forward, his hands resting on his bony knees. Symbols of faith, a cross, a blessed medal, any item truly sacred to you. Some managed to escape by biting these objects at the crucial moment. Then, in a surprisingly quick movement for someone his age, Don Fernando grabbed Ethan's wrist with unexpected strength. "But the best advice I can give is, she chooses those who already have darkness in their hearts. Men who have betrayed their promises, who have deceived those they love, who live double lives." The old man's eyes seemed to peer straight into Ethan's soul, as if he could see every secret, every lie, every betrayal. "She's already chosen you, hasn't she?" whispered Don Fernando. "I can see it in your eyes, the darkness and the fear. You know you deserve what's coming." The sun began its descent behind the mountains as the jeep traveled along a red dirt road that wound between coffee plantations and dense tropical vegetation. After the disturbing interview with Don Fernando, a tense silence had settled among the team members. Miguel drove with his eyes fixed on the road, occasionally muttering something inaudible. Sophia reviewed her notes with an intensity that seemed more like an attempt to avoid thinking about what they had heard. And Carlos obsessively checked his equipment, as if seeking comfort in the technical familiarity of his work. Ethan, sitting in the passenger seat, fought intrusive thoughts about Claire, About Lucia, about the old man's words that seemed to have pierced some carefully constructed barrier in his mind. "There," Miguel said finally, pointing to a widening in the road near a small wooden bridge. "This is the intersection I mentioned. 4 roads meet here, and just beyond is the Motagua River. Many reports of Siguanaba come from this specific location." As they parked and began unloading their equipment, Ethan noticed how the air seemed thicker here, charged not just with tropical humidity, but with something more intangible, an oppressive quality that pressed against his skin like invisible hands. Dusk was advancing quickly, turning the bright red of the earth into a dried blood brown, while elongated shadows reached out from the trees like fingers reaching for them. "We'll start with some shots of the intersection, then we'll get down to the river before it gets completely dark," Ethan instructed, trying to inject a professionalism into his voice that he didn't really feel. Carlos positioned himself, adjusting his camera settings to compensate for the rapidly decreasing light. "Wait," he said suddenly, freezing in position. "Do you see that?" Ethan followed the direction of her gaze. Approximately 100 meters away on the road heading west, a female figure dressed in white seemed to be standing still as a statue. The distance and dim light made it impossible to make out her features, but the way she remained absolutely still, as if she were observing the group, sent shivers down Ethan's spine. "I'm capturing it," Carlos whispered, activating the zoom on his camera. The enlarged image flickered for a moment as he adjusted the focus, but when it finally stabilized, there was nothing there. The road was completely empty. "I'm sure I saw someone," Carlos insisted, the nervousness evident in his voice. "A woman in a white dress standing right there." Miguel, who had remained close to the jeep, discreetly made that same protective gesture that Ethan had noticed before. "Let's continue with the plan," Ethan said firmly, even though he felt his own pulse quicken. "Let's go down to the river now, before we lose the light completely." The group followed a narrow trail that led to the bank of the Motagua, whose dark waters flowed silently between mossy rocks. While they were installing the lighting equipment and directive microphones to capture the ambient sound, Sophia let out a small scream. Everyone turned to her, instant tension palpable in the air. "I'm sorry," she said, visibly upset. "It's just, there's something on my equipment." With fingers shaking slightly, she lifted a single long strand of black hair, much longer than her own, which was tied into a bun wrapped around the microphone stand. "It wasn't here when I put the equipment away this morning. I'm sure of it." Darkness was now falling quickly, as if the night was eager to envelop them. Ethan positioned himself on the riverbank, the lavalier microphone picking up his voice as he recorded an introduction for the documentary. The artificial lights created a small circle of visibility surrounded by impenetrable darkness, the sound of running water providing an unsettling soundtrack to his words about local legend. It was during a pause in his narration that he noticed, not with sight, but with that primal sense that warns humans about being watched. Looking at the dark surface of the river, where the light from the equipment created a flickering reflection, Ethan glimpsed not his own image, but that of a woman with long black hair looking directly at him from the other bank. He turned sharply, almost losing his balance on the slippery rock. But the opposite bank was completely empty, just darkness and the silhouette of trees against the night sky. "Ethan, are you okay?" Sophia approached, genuine concern in her voice. "You seem to have seen He forced a tight smile. "I'm fine. Just a weird reflection in the water." But his eyes continued to scan the opposite bank, and his heart refused to return to its normal rhythm. As they completed filming and began putting away equipment, Carlos made a disturbing discovery while reviewing the audio recordings. "Listen to this," he said, plugging headphones into the digital recorder. One by one, they listened to the passage that had caught their attention. During a moment of complete silence in the recording, when Ethan was collecting his thoughts and no one was speaking, a female voice could clearly be heard whispering something in an ancient Mayan dialect, a voice that belonged to no one on the team. Miguel, the last to hear, ripped off his headphones as if they were burning his ears. "I don't like it," he declared firmly. "We are provoking things that should be left alone." His behavior had changed drastically since the beginning of the day. Now he repeatedly made the sign of the cross and muttered prayers under his breath, looking nervously at the shadows that surrounded them. Back in the Jeep, as Miguel carefully maneuvered through the dark roads, Ethan's phone buzzed with a new message. Expecting to see Lucia's name, he felt his blood run cold when he noticed that it came from an unidentified number. The message contained only a series of GPS coordinates and the words, "Meet me tonight alone." Feeling Sophia's eyes on his profile, Ethan quickly put away his phone, but not before noticing that the coordinates indicated a location less than 2 kilometers from his hotel, close to a ravine that, according to the map they had consulted earlier, was another location frequently associated with Siguanaba sightings. Looking out the window into the Guatemalan night, Ethan could have sworn he saw, for a split second, a woman in a white dress running alongside the Jeep, keeping her pace perfectly despite the speed, and then disappearing into the trees like mist in the sun. "Are you sure you want to do this? Now? At night?" Miguel's voice trembled slightly as the Jeep traveled along the steep path that led to the top of La Carrera ravine. The coordinates Ethan had received pointed to this specific location, a deep gorge just a few kilometers from the city of Antigua, where the group had stayed. After a tense dinner during which no one mentioned the afternoon's strange incidents, Ethan had announced that he wanted to capture some nighttime images of the ravine, a location that, according to his research, was often associated with reports of the Siguanaba. Sophia had chosen to stay at the hotel, citing a headache, but Carlos and Miguel, despite their obvious reservations, accompanied the director. The full moon illuminated the landscape with an almost supernatural brightness, turning the canyon into a silvery scar on the dark earth and casting sharp, angular shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. "It's the perfect time," Ethan replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The truth was that ever since he had received those coordinates, he had felt an almost irresistible compulsion to visit this place, as if an invisible hook had lodged itself in its center and was now pulling him inexorably forward. There was also another motivation he hadn't shared with the team. Lucia, his Guatemalan lover, had finally responded, suggesting a secret meeting. The coincidence of the coordinates she had sent with those of the unknown number was disturbing, but Ethan had rationalized it as some kind of digital error. Just a few panoramic shots of the landscape under the moonlight, maybe a voiceover on local reports. 2 hours tops, he added, noting how Carlos held his camera too tightly, his knuckles white against the black plastic. When the Jeep finally stopped at the natural viewpoint that offered views of the gorge, an oppressive silence enveloped them. No insects sang, no nightbirds called, not even the wind dared to whisper through the trees. It was as if all of nature was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The moon shed its spectral light over the scene, revealing the vertiginous depth of the ravine. whose bottom was invisible in the complete darkness that not even moonlight could penetrate. "A fall from here would be fatal," Miguel commented unnecessarily, staying several meters from the edge while Carlos prepared the tripod for the first shots. The air seemed thicker, charged with an electric quality that made the hairs on Ethan's arms stand up, and a strange odor permeated the place. Not unpleasant, but definitely unnatural. Something like very sweet flowers mixed with damp earth, and a metallic touch reminiscent of blood. "Did you guys hear that?" Carlos suddenly stopped setting up his camera, turning toward the dense line of trees growing precariously at the edge of the canyon. Ethan and Miguel fell silent, focusing on the sounds of the night. For a few seconds, nothing but that unnatural silence. Then, soft, distant, but unmistakable, the sound of a woman singing a hypnotic melody in a language neither of them recognized. "Must be someone from the nearby farms," Ethan suggested without conviction. The voice was too clear, too present to come from so far away, and yet it had an ethereal quality, as if it reached them not through the air but directly into their minds. Carlos took a few steps towards the trees, the camera now raised and recording. "There's someone there," he whispered, adjusting his focus. "A woman, my God, she's beautiful." Before Ethan or Miguel could react, Carlos quickly advanced toward the tree line, as if pulled by an invisible force. "Carlos, wait!" shouted Ethan, but the cameraman had already disappeared into the thick shadows of the woods, the light from his camera visible for only a few more seconds before disappearing completely. Miguel grabbed Ethan's arm as he prepared to head in the same direction. "Don't separate," warned the guide, his face drawn in fear. "It's exactly what she wants." Ethan hesitated only for a moment before letting go abruptly. "Don't be ridiculous. Carlos could be in real danger. Maybe he got too close to the edge." Taking a flashlight from his pocket, he advanced into the trees, repeatedly calling the cameraman's name. Miguel, after a moment of visible indecision, swore in Spanish and followed, his own flashlight creating a second, flickering beam of light in the oppressive darkness. The next few minutes turned into an increasingly desperate search through the shadowy forest. Lantern beams danced among ancient trunks and undergrowth, while cries for Carlos were answered only by the distorted echo of their own voices returning from the canyon, as if some entity mocked their efforts. The sweet metallic scent grew stronger as they went, and Ethan began to notice something disturbing about the trees. Symbols carved into the trunks, intricate geometric patterns that seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place where. "I don't like this," Miguel muttered, now so close to Ethan that he was almost stepping on his heels. "These are ancient symbols, predating even the Mayans. We shouldn't be here." But before Ethan could respond, his beam illuminated something on the forest floor, near the edge of the cliff. Carlos's camera, lying on its side, still turned on and silently recording the darkness. There was no sign of the cameraman anywhere. Ethan picked up the camera carefully, his stomach tightening with a terrible foreboding. "Carlos!" he shouted one last time, his voice echoing across the canyon with no response. Miguel was now just a few steps away from the edge, his beam of light trying to penetrate the impenetrable darkness below. "I can't see the bottom," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's too deep. If he fell." The sentence was incomplete, the implication too clear to articulate. Ethan felt a sudden nausea, as he realized that on some level he was relieved that Lucia hadn't shown up for their secret rendezvous. The realization came with shame and guilt. While he was preoccupied with his extramarital affair, a man had disappeared, possibly due to his reckless decisions. Back in the Jeep, the silence between them was as heavy as concrete. They had searched the area for over an hour without finding any other trace of Carlos. A call to the local police generated a lukewarm response. They would send someone in the morning, they said. But accidents in La Correra were not uncommon. Careless tourists often underestimated the danger of the gorge, especially at night. As Miguel drove back to the hotel, his knuckles white around the steering wheel, Ethan connected Carlos's camera to the laptop he kept in his backpack. "What are you doing?" Miguel asked, casting nervous glances at the director. "We need to see the last images he captured," Ethan replied, his professional voice masking the terror growing within him. "There might be some clues." Carlos's last filming began normally. Images of the ravine under the moonlight, a few seconds of Miguel's tense face, the line of trees in the distance. Then the camera moved quickly, as if Carlos had suddenly seen something that demanded his immediate attention. For a few seconds, just blurs of vegetation as he ran. Then the image stabilized, and Ethan felt his blood freeze in his veins. Partially visible among the trees was a woman, or something in the shape of a woman. The distance and poor lighting made it impossible to make out her face, but she wore a white dress that seemed to glow with its own light, and her long black hair flowed around her as if submerged, despite the absence of wind. Most disturbing, however, was his posture. Completely still except for one hand extended in a gesture of invitation, the fingers impossibly long and slender. The camera moved towards him, Carlos's heavy breathing audible in the recording. When she was only a few feet away from the figure. She slowly turned around, beginning to reveal her profile. At that exact moment, the footage became violently unstable, as if Carlos had tripped or been pushed. A scream cut through the audio, a sound that didn't sound entirely human. A mix of terror and surprise so pure it chilled Ethan to the core. The last image, before the camera apparently fell to the ground, captured something that made Miguel turn his face away, muttering quick, frantic prayers. Just a partial glimpse of what could be a face, but with completely the wrong proportions. Elongated and distorted like an equine skull, the eyes reflecting the camera light like those of an animal in the darkness. Hours later, alone in his hotel room, Ethan still couldn't fully process the night's events. The police had been notified. A formal search would be launched at dawn, but the authorities did not seem particularly optimistic. "La Correra has already taken many," the officer commented on the phone, with the casualness of someone discussing the weather. "Especially those who go there at night." Sitting on the edge of the bed, Ethan held his phone, staring at the blank screen. No message from Lucia since the one that matched the mysterious coordinates. His attempts to call her went straight to voicemail. It was as if she too had disappeared, or maybe. A terrible thought began to form in his mind, but he quickly shook it off. Coincidences, nothing more. It had to be. Exhausted, he dragged himself to the bathroom to wash his face before trying to get a few hours of sleep. The cold water brought momentary relief, clearing his thoughts clouded by exhaustion and residual adrenaline. Drying his face with a towel, Ethan finally looked up at the mirror above the sink and froze, the towel falling from his suddenly lifeless hands. For a split second, so brief that he could easily attribute it to exhaustion or a trick of the light, he saw not his own reflection, but another face superimposed on his own. An impossible face, elongated and distorted, with large black eyes set sideways like a horse's, and long, pointed teeth visible through lips stretched in a smile that contained absolutely no humanity. When he blinked, the image disappeared, leaving only his own pale, terrified face. But the smell was there, that same sweet metallic odor that permeated the ravine. And in the fogged mirror, a single word appeared as if written by an invisible finger: deserved. The National Library of Guatemala stood like a monument to history, its centuries-old stone walls stoically resisting the chaotic traffic and modernity that surrounded it. 2 days had passed since Carlos disappeared. Official searches, as Ethan secretly hoped, found nothing other than confirmed skid marks near the edge of the gorge, leading authorities to conclude that the cameraman had accidentally fallen. Case closed. But for Ethan, Miguel, and Sofia, the reality was much more complex and disturbing. What they had witnessed, what Carlos's camera had captured, went beyond any rational explanation. After a sleepless night filled with fragmented nightmares about long black hair and abnormally sharp teeth, Ethan had decided they needed more information. Not for the documentary now, but for his own survival. "Professor Alvarez will see us in his office at 2, Sofia announced, hanging up the phone as they sat at a table far away in the nearly empty library. Miguel had refused to accompany them, claiming he needed to organize Carlos's replacement and resolve logistical issues. But Ethan suspected that the guide simply didn't want any more involvement in investigating the legend. "He is the leading authority on comparative Central American Mayan mythology," continued Sofia. "If anyone can give us historical context about what we're facing, it's him." His eyes, Ethan noticed, were lined with deep circles, indicating that he wasn't the only one suffering from insomnia. In between searches in the dusty archives, she glanced uneasily at the high windows, as if expecting to see a face watching them from outside. Spread out on the dark wooden table were documents they had requested, historical records of accidents and disappearances in the La Correra ravine region, yellowed newspaper clippings reporting encounters with a mysterious woman on rural roads, and some transcripts of interviews with survivors who claimed to have escaped the Siguanaba. Ethan was methodically flipping through a file, highlighting patterns and inconsistencies, when his finger froze on a date. "Look at this," he said, pushing the document toward Sofia. "Disappearances in clusters, always at the same approximate period every 7 years." Sofia examined the dates, her eyes gradually widening. 1979, 1986, 1993, 2000, 2007, 2014, and now 2021, she whispered. "It can't be a coincidence." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine, not just from discovering the pattern, but because he suddenly understood that they had arrived in Guatemala at exactly the beginning of the current cycle, as if something had drawn them specifically to this moment, this place. The University of San Carlos campus was buzzing with students when they arrived to meet Professor Alvarez. The contrast between the normal, vibrant life around them and the supernatural terror they investigated seemed almost absurd to Ethan. How could the world continue to spin normally when Carlos was gone, possibly killed by an entity that defied modern understanding? When Ethan himself could be marked as the next victim, the thought was interrupted by the arrival at the door of the anthropology department, where a discreet sign identified the office of Professor Diego Alvarez, Ph.D., Cultural Anthropology and Comparative Archaeology. The man who greeted them was the opposite of what Ethan had expected. Not an elderly, stooped academic, but a strapping Guatemalan in his 50s, with short gray hair and lively eyes behind modern glasses. His office was a fascinating mix of academic rigor and traditional Mayan elements. Neat shelves of scholarly publications shared space with ceremonial artifacts and replicas of ancient stelae. "The disappearance of your colleague is deeply regrettable," Alvarez said after the introductions, his English largely accentless. But I must confess I'm not surprised, considering where they were and what they were doing. His eyes fixed on Ethan with a disconcerting intensity. The Siguanaba is no ordinary folk legend, Mr. Morgan. It is not simply a story to scare children, or a figment of the rural imagination. There is a historical and metaphysical core to this entity that dates back to periods before the Mayan civilization itself. The professor stood up, moving to a bookshelf from which he removed an ancient leather-bound volume. The oldest records we have suggest that Siguanaba, the original name before linguistic corruption for Siguanaba, was a high-ranking priestess in a cult dedicated to the goddess Ixchel, associated with water, fertility, and significantly, punishment. He opened the book, revealing illustrations of a woman performing rituals near a body of water. The story of her infidelity and maternal neglect is probably a later addendum, a moralization of something much more complex. So what's the real story? Ethan asked, leaning forward, fully engaged despite the exhaustion weighing him down. Alvarez adjusted his glasses, his expression becoming more serious. From what we can reconstruct, Siguanaba was responsible for purification rituals that occurred every 7 years, a sacred cycle in the ancient calendar. These rituals involved the identification and punishment of those who had violated sacred oaths, especially those related to family and community. He turned a few pages, showing drawings of ceremonies held on the banks of rivers and canyons. Individuals considered impure, adulterers, fathers and mothers who abandoned their responsibilities, those who broke sacred promises, were subjected to a transformation ritual that supposedly revealed their true inner nature. The way the teacher pronounced transformation sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. There was archaeological evidence of these rituals, Alvarez continued. Specific sites, always near bodies of water or deep gorges, containing ceremonial artifacts and, disturbingly, human remains with intentional cranial modifications. He visibly hesitated before opening a drawer in his filing cabinet and extracting a folder labeled "Confidential." This is not public knowledge, and I ask for maximum discretion. Inside were photographs of a recent archaeological dig near a river. The images showed human skeletons arranged in ritual patterns, but what immediately captured Ethan's attention were the skulls, all artificially elongated into shapes that vaguely resembled equines, with precise cut marks suggesting the removal of flesh while still alive. These were found at a site near La Carrera, dating back to approximately 2,000 years ago, explained Alvarez. Most significantly, they were discovered in a layer corresponding exactly to one of the 7-year cycles. While Alvarez continued, his explanation about the priestess entity's evolution to being supernatural, Sophia had stepped aside to examine some documents on a side table. "Professor," she interrupted suddenly, her voice strained. "This document in Spanish seems to suggest that Siguanaba may possess people?" Alvarez looked at the paper she held, nodding slowly. "It is an account from 1878, documented by a Jesuit priest. The theory was that the entity could temporarily inhabit bodies of people close to the chosen victim, often family or close friends, as a way of gaining access to the primary victim. Reports consistently mention sudden behavioral changes in nearby people, staring periods of unexplained absence before the final disappearance of the primary victim." He adjusted his glasses, closely watching Ethan's reaction. This aligns with the belief that the Siguanaba is not simply a solitary entity, but a manifestation of a cosmic principle of justice, capable of operating across multiple vectors to reach its prey. Ethan felt his blood run cold in his veins. Miguel, with his increasingly strange behavior. Sophia, coincidentally, finding that specific document. And Lucia. Where was Lucia? I hadn't been able to contact her since Carlos disappeared. His mouth was suddenly dry as sand. "Is there any way to protect yourself?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Alvarez studied him for a long moment before responding. "Mr. Morgan, I have to ask, is there any specific reason why you fear being targeted by this entity? Something in your personal behavior, perhaps?" The question hung in the air like a veiled accusation. Ethan felt the weight of Sophia's gaze, wondering how much she suspected about his secret life. His furtive encounters with Lucia, his lies to Claire. "It's just a professional question," he finally replied, avoiding the professor's piercing gaze. "We are all potentially at risk after what happened to Carlos." Alvarez seemed unconvinced, but continued. "Traditional protections include symbols of genuine faith, but this depends on individual belief. Some texts suggest that openly confronting and acknowledging one's transgressions can placate the entity, although reports of success are rare." He closed the book with a deliberate movement. "The most effective, historically, would be to simply leave the region immediately, before the demonstration cycle runs its course." The look he gave Ethan contained a clear warning that didn't need to be voiced. Hours later, sitting in a small cafe several blocks from the hotel, Ethan nervously checked his watch. I had finally received a message from Lucia, a brief, strange response after days of silence. "Café Antigua, 5 p.m. We need to talk." The establishment was almost empty at that hour, the barista bored playing on his phone behind the counter, while soft instrumental music played over the speakers. Every time the door opened, Ethan jumped, his heart racing. What if it wasn't Lucia who appeared, but something using her appearance? Alvarez's words about possession echoed in his mind. Just as he was about to give up, concluding that he had been lured into some kind of trap, the cafe door opened once more and Lucia walked in, her flawless olive skin, lush black hair framing the delicate Mayan face that had captivated him since their first meeting a year earlier, during his preliminary research trip. "I missed you," she said as she sat down, her familiar scent, tropical flowers and something underlying, earthier, enveloping him. His eyes, however, looked different, darker, deeper. Ethan couldn't put his finger on exactly what had changed, but something was definitely different. "Where have you been? I tried to contact you for days," he asked, studying her closely. Lucia smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I had to visit my family in Quetzaltenango. Family emergency." Your hand covered his on the table, fingers unusually cold against his skin. "I heard what happened to your cameraman. What a terrible tragedy." The way she said terrible, stretching the word out slightly, almost savoring it, sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "How did you know that?" he asked, his throat suddenly tight. She shrugged casually. "News travels fast in small places. Everyone is talking about the American who disappeared in La Carrera." Her fingers stroked his in a hypnotic pattern. "They say he was taken by the Siguanaba. Do you believe that, Ethan?" The question hung between them like toxic smoke. Something in Lucia's eyes, a predatory gleam, an almost hungry intensity, made Ethan feel like a rat being watched by a snake. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he answered honestly, trying to control the tremor in his voice. Lucia leaned. forward, her face now very close to his. For a moment so brief that he could easily attribute it to the cafe's lighting or his own growing paranoia, Ethan thought he saw something move beneath the skin of her face, as if the underlying bone structure were momentarily rearranging itself. "You should believe it," she whispered, her breath strangely cold against his face. "Some legends exist for a reason. Some punishments are deserved." Her eyes, fixed on his, seemed to momentarily change shape, the pupils elongating vertically before returning to normal. Especially for men who cheat on their wives and build lives based on lies. His smile widened a fraction beyond what seemed anatomically possible. "Don't you agree, Ethan?" Cantina del Camino was exactly the kind of establishment the tour guides didn't mention. A dusty roadside bar on the fringes of Guatemala City, frequented exclusively by truck drivers, farm workers, and the occasional lost traveler. Faded neon lights flickered erratically over the entrance, where a partially broken beer sign swayed in the night breeze. Ethan nervously adjusted the new camera on his shoulder as Miguel parked the Jeep in the gravel area that served as the parking lot. After his unsettling encounter with Lucia in the cafe, he had practically fled back to the hotel, claiming a sudden migraine that was not entirely fictitious. The way she had watched him as he left, with that same slightly distorted smile, confirmed his darkest suspicions. Something was using Lucia as a vehicle, approaching him through his own lover. The cruel irony of the situation was not lost on him. "Are you sure about this?" asked Sophia, her face lit intermittently by the red neon, creating an unsettling effect of pulsing blood on her skin. "This place doesn't exactly feel safe." 3 days had passed since the visit to Professor Alvarez, and production on the documentary was officially on pause following Carlos's disappearance. But Ethan had insisted on doing one last interview with a man Miguel had reluctantly admitted to knowing, Javier Ortiz, a truck driver who had supposedly survived a direct encounter with the Siguanaba 2 years earlier. "We need first-hand testimony," Ethan had responded automatically, although everyone knew his motivation transcended any professional concerns. He was desperately searching for answers, for some hope of escaping the fate that seemed inexorably approaching. The interior of the cantina was surprisingly quiet for an establishment with almost every table occupied. Men with sun-bleached faces and hard work looked up briefly as the trio entered, before returning to their glasses and murmured conversations. One man, however, continued to watch them, sitting alone in a far corner, a massive body draped in a faded plaid shirt, his face partially hidden beneath a worn cap emblazoned with the logo of a shipping company. Miguel nodded in their direction, guiding Ethan and Sophia through the maze of tables. "Javier," he murmured as they approached. "Estos son los americanos de los que te hablé." The large man nodded silently, his eyes remarkably red and bloodshot, like someone who hadn't slept properly in a long time, fixing Ethan with an uncomfortable intensity. "I'm not interested in appearing on camera," were his first words in surprisingly fluent, if heavily accented English. "I have enough problems without people thinking I'm crazy." Ethan nodded, turning off the camera and placing it on the nearby chair, a gesture of good faith. When everyone was seated with drinks served by a taciturn bartender, Javier leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the ambient noise. "Miguel told me that you are looking for information about La Siguanaba, that you lost a friend to her." It wasn't a question. Ethan felt his throat tighten but nodded. "And now you think she's after you." Again, not a question but a direct statement that made Sophia gasp softly beside him. Javier took a long drink of his beer before continuing, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. It was 2 years ago. I was coming back from a delivery in Huehuetenango. Late at night, the road was deserted. You know how it is, the kind of loneliness that starts to mess with your head after a few hours. His thick fingers drummed nervously on the table. I saw her first in the high beams. A woman on the side of the road, white dress, long dark hair. I thought she was a lost tourist or someone with a broken down car. In that region, at night, leaving someone on the road is practically sentencing them to death. Javier paused, his eyes momentarily unfocusing as if he was reliving the scene. I stopped the truck, offered her a ride. She got in without saying anything, just smiling. My God, that smile. His voice trailed off slightly. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Perfect skin, eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. The driver looked away, fixing it on some invisible point beyond the cantina walls. She sat in the passenger seat, still smiling. I asked her where she was going, and she just pointed straight ahead. I thought it was strange, but I kept driving, so... He swallowed visibly, the Adam's apple bobbing up and down in his thick neck. Then I noticed the smell, too sweet like rotting flowers, and cold, a cold that didn't come from outside but seemed to come out of her as if it were leaking ice through her body. Javier unconsciously rubbed his arms, as if he felt that cold again. I tried to make conversation, ask her name. That's when she turned to me. At first she was still pretty, but something was off. Her neck seemed too long, her eyes too far apart. Then, her voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in to listen. Then his face began to change, as if the bones beneath his skin were moving, stretching. His eyes became too big, moving to the sides of his head. His mouth stretched, showing teeth that no human should have. He visibly shivered. And all the time, she kept smiling, that smile that now took up half her face. "How did you escape?" asked Ethan, his own voice almost unrecognizable in his ears. In response, Javier pulled a chain from inside his shirt, revealing a worn silver medal. "Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers. Gift from my grandmother when I started driving." "Do you know what she said? If you ever meet the devil on the road, bite this with all your faith." He pointed to teeth marks clearly visible on the medal. It was instinct. When I saw that face, I was no longer human. Something inside me knew I was going to die. I bit the metal so hard I broke a tooth. His eyes shone with intense emotion. She screamed. Not like a woman, but like a wounded animal, a sound no human throat could make. I opened the door and threw myself from the moving truck. I rolled onto the road, cut myself all over, broke 2 ribs in my wrist. He raised his left arm, showing a long, jagged scar. When I looked back, she was standing in the road, watching me. For a second, she looked normal again, just a beautiful woman. Then she turned and walked into the forest. But before she disappeared into the trees, she looked back once more, and there was no face there. Just darkness, like a hole in reality. A heavy silence fell on the table when Javier finished his report. In the back of the cantina, someone turned on a radio. Old songs mixing with static, creating a surreal soundtrack to the moment. "You're lucky to be alive," Miguel said finally, the first time he had spoken since they had sat down. His voice sounded strange, slightly monotonous, and when Ethan looked at him, he noticed that the guide was watching him with an unsettling intensity. Javier followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched Miguel, before turning his attention back to Ethan. "You want to know why she chose you?" he said abruptly. "Why is it after you specifically?" It wasn't a question. "You know the answer. Everyone she pursues knows exactly why." Ethan felt exposed, as if the man could read every dirty secret in his mind. Claire, Lucia, everyone else over the years. The overlapping lies that had become as natural as breathing. Javier leaned in further, his face now inches away from Ethan's. "She's already marked you, I can see it in your eyes." His thick, calloused fingers suddenly gripped Ethan's wrist with surprising strength. There's a glow there, a reflection that shouldn't be there, like something is already looking through them. Sophia gasped, her hand involuntarily covering her mouth. "How long has it been since it started?" asked Javier, his voice now urgent. "The dreams about her, the black hair that shows through your clothes, the wrong reflections in the mirrors, the time lapses you can't explain?" An icy knot formed in Ethan's stomach. How could this stranger know about the dreams he had been having? About the strands of black hair he had found on his pillow at the hotel, even though he was alone? About the 20 inexplicable minutes he had lost the previous morning, finding himself in a part of the hotel with no memory of how he got there? "I don't have much time," Javier continued, his grip on Ethan's wrist tightening. "She doesn't like me talking about this. She's tried to silence me before. Listen carefully. What you're facing is no ordinary ghost or demon. It's something older, more fundamental, a twisted principle of justice that has found physical form. It can't be killed or exorcised, only temporarily placated or avoided." His bloodshot eyes quickly swept the bar, as if searching for unseen observers. "You need to leave Guatemala, immediately. Tonight. Go back to your wife. Confess your sins, beg for forgiveness. Maybe, just maybe, physical distance will break the connection enough to—" Javier stopped abruptly mid-sentence, his eyes fixating on something behind Ethan. His face visibly paled, the hand around Ethan's wrist loosening. "She's here," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "Don't look now, near the door." Ethan felt his blood freeze, every hair on his body standing up simultaneously. With a deliberately casual movement, he turned as if he was merely adjusting his position in the uncomfortable chair. Near the entrance to the cantina, partially hidden by the shadows, stood a female figure in a white dress, black hair cascading down her shoulders. Her face was tilted at just the right angle to remain in the shadows, but Ethan knew, with a visceral certainty, that she was looking right at him. "We need to go," Sophia said, her voice shaking with fear. "Now." In a blur of confused movements, they said goodbye to Javier, who remained frozen in his seat, eyes fixed on the figure near the door, and hurriedly left through the cantina's side entrance. When they reached the jeep, Ethan quickly glanced back. The figure was gone, the entrance now empty except for the bar's regulars. Miguel started the engine with visibly shaking hands, and they took off at high speed, headlights piercing the darkness of the rural road as they returned to town. No one spoke for several minutes, the only sound being Sophia's rapid breathing in the back seat and the roar of the engine forced beyond its limits. It was when they were approximately halfway back that the engine suddenly failed. The Jeep sputtered, lost power, and finally died completely, stopping in the middle of the deserted road. "What is happening?" Ethan asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Miguel turned the key repeatedly, but the engine didn't even show a sign of life. "I don't know," he replied, his voice strangely dispassionate. "It was working perfectly." He tried once more before letting out an exaggeratedly theatrical sigh. "I'll check under the hood. Maybe it's something simple. Before Ethan could protest, Miguel had exited the vehicle, disappearing into the darkness ahead. "There's something wrong with him," Sophia whispered, leaning forward between the front seats. "Have you noticed how he's looking at you? How he's acting? Ever since Carlos disappeared, it's like—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Ethan knew exactly what she meant. Alvarez's words about the Siguanaba possessing people close to its chosen victim echoed in his mind. "We need to get out of here," he said, reaching for the door handle. At that very moment, however, something on the road ahead captured his attention. A white figure, indistinct in the darkness but unmistakably female, standing approximately 50 meters away. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed the camera on the next seat, turning it on and pointing it at the apparition. The digital zoom advanced, focusing on the figure, and for a fleeting moment he glimpsed what appeared to be Lucia, or was it Claire? The figure seemed to change subtly as he watched, like one image superimposed on another, both familiar and at the same time terribly wrong. "Ethan!" Sophia's scream broke him out of his trance. He turned to find her staring in horror out the aisle side window, where Miguel's face was pressed against the glass, watching them. But it was no longer completely Miguel's face. The eyes were positioned incorrectly, too far apart, and the mouth was stretched into an impossible smile that revealed teeth that were too long and pointy. And his eyes reflected the moonlight like those of a nocturnal animal, glowing, with a bluish luminescence that no human being should possess. Somehow they had survived the night before. When Miguel, or whatever was using Miguel's body, pressed his face against the Jeep's window with that impossible smile, Sophia had reacted instinctively, turning on her cell phone's flashlight, directly into the creature's reflective eyes. The being retreated with an inhuman hiss, giving them precious seconds to lock the doors. Then, miraculously, the Jeep's engine came back to life without any intervention, as if the entity itself was just toying with them. Sophia had taken the wheel, driving frantically back to the hotel while Ethan watched the road ahead, where the Iastam female figure had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. Of Miguel, no sign, just the distant echo of something that could be a laugh or a scream, difficult to distinguish in the oppressive darkness. Now, locked in his hotel room, Ethan has awakened violently from yet another nightmare. His body, drenched in cold sweat despite the air conditioning turned off. It was 3:33 in the morning, the exact same time I had woken up the previous 2 nights. In dreams, he walked through an endless gorge, chasing a woman in a white dress whose long, black hair flowed without wind. Every time he was about to reach her, she turned around. But where there should have been a face, there was only a black void, an abyss that seemed to suck him in. And deep within that abyss, something waited, something ancient and patient, something that knew him more intimately than any human ever could. His hands shook as he reached for his cell phone on the nightstand. 3 missed calls from Claire, a voice message. Reluctantly, she pressed the button to listen. "Ethan, it's 2 in the morning here and you promised to call. I'm worried. The news mentioned a missing American in Guatemala, and you haven't answered in days. Please call me as soon as you hear this. Please." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, sending a wave of guilt through her exhausted body. Claire, who deserved a better husband. Claire, who had remained by his side during the years of struggle, when his documentaries were rejected by every festival, when they had to sell their car to pay the rent. Claire, who he had betrayed repeatedly, without hesitation, as if their commitment meant nothing. With fingers heavy with fatigue, He dialed the familiar number. Even with the time difference, I knew she would answer. Claire always kept her phone nearby, in case something happened, she said. And sure enough, she answered on the second ring, her voice instantly alert despite the hour. "Ethan, are you okay?" The genuine concern in his voice was like a knife twisting in his chest. "I'm alive," he replied, hating how his voice sounded. Worn out, exhausted, defeated. There were complications with the filming. Carlos disappeared. The words came out mechanically as he explained the official version of events. The accident in the gorge, the fruitless searches. He omitted everything about Siguanaba, about Miguel's distorted face, about Lucia. More lies to add to the pile. "You should go home," Claire said after listening in silence. "That seems too dangerous. The documentary isn't worth your life, Ethan." If she had known the truth, that danger would follow him no matter where he was, that it was personal now, that he was being hunted by something he couldn't escape, perhaps she wouldn't have been so quick to want his return. "It's not that simple," he replied, rubbing his burning eyes. "I need to finish what I started here." It was a half-truth. He needed to face what he had unleashed, although he had no idea how. A silence stretched between them, filled with years of unsaid things. "There's something you're not telling me," Claire said finally, her voice now cautiously neutral. "Again." The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Ethan could deny her, as he had done so many times before. I could weave another web of plausible lies, tell another convincing story. He was good at it. Telling stories was his job, after all. But something had changed. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe the proximity of death. Maybe the growing feeling that he was losing his humanity with each passing hour. "There is a woman," he admitted suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Lucia, a local guide I met during preliminary research last year." The silence on the other side was deafening. When Claire finally spoke, her voice was so controlled it sounded like it belonged to a stranger. "How long?" Ethan closed his eyes, wishing he could disappear. "Since the first visit. A year or so." Another unbearable silence. "Is this the first time?" The question was asked so quietly that he almost didn't hear it. Almost. "Claire, She interrupted him, her voice now shaking with a restrained anger he had rarely witnessed. "No. Answer the question, Ethan. Is this the first time? Or have there been others?" The answer stuck in his throat. The silence stretched for 5, 10, 15 seconds. "I get it," Claire said finally, her voice now strangely calm. "When you come back, if you come back, my stuff won't be here anymore. I hope it's worth it, Ethan." The call ended abruptly, leaving him holding the useless phone to his ear, hearing only the hiss of the deadline. 2 hours and 4 shots of whiskey later, Ethan was sitting in a dark corner of the hotel bar, the place practically empty at this early hour. The sleepy bartender had eventually left the bottle on the table, tired of serving the trembling American, whose bloodshot eyes constantly scanned the shadows of the room. Sophia met him there, her face a mask of concern as she sat down in the opposite chair without invitation. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "Didn't sleep?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh, pouring himself another shot. "Sleep? With that thing wearing Miguel's face out there? With Carlos missing? With..." He made a vague gesture, encompassing everything and nothing. Sophia studied him for a long moment before taking the bottle and pouring herself modestly. "I spoke to the American embassy," she said after a cautious sip. "We can get emergency flights for tomorrow. We need to get out of here, Ethan. You heard Javier. Distance can break the connection. The mention of the truck driver brought back the image of those bloodshot eyes, of the desperate grip on his wrist. She's already marked you. I can see it in your eyes. Ethan emptied his glass in a single movement. It won't help, he murmured, the words slightly slurred by the alcohol. She chose me. You heard the teacher. People like me are her target. Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean by people like you? The question hovered between them, carrying an invisible weight. Ethan felt something break inside him, some last resistance giving way under the combined pressure of supernatural terror and mundane guilt. Men who cheat, he said finally, the words coming out like a forced confession. Men who break promises. Men who live double lives. He stared at the empty glass, unable to meet Sophia's gaze. Lucia isn't the first. There have been others, many others. In every city, every film festival, every filming location, the words now flowed like a poisonous river long dammed. 15 years of marriage, Sophia. 15 years of lying. I became so good at it that sometimes I didn't even realize I was lying. It was like breathing. He finally looked up, finding not the judgment he expected on her face, but something worse. Understanding. And Claire never knew? Sophia asked softly. Ethan shook his head slowly. She suspected. Several times. I always denied it. I always had an explanation. It always made her feel crazy for doubting. He ran his hands over his tired face. Until today, I told you about Lucia, not the others, but that was enough. When we come back, if we come back, she won't be there. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant clink of glasses being washed behind the bar. That's why Siguanaba is chasing you, Sophia said finally. The stories always mention it. She punishes men who betray, who deceive, who break sacred promises. Ethan nodded miserably. The perfect cliché, isn't it? The documentary filmmaker who goes to investigate a supernatural legend, only to discover that he himself is the villain of the story. A bitter laugh escaped his throat. If this were one of my films, the audience would be rooting for the monster right now. At that moment, his phone vibrated on the table. A new email, the icon flashing on the locked screen. Sliding his finger, almost automatically to unlock it, Ethan felt his blood run cold in his veins. The message had no identifiable sender, just a cryptic subject line. She sleeps alone now. The body of the email contained just one image, a photograph of Claire, sleeping in her bed in Los Angeles, the same bed they had shared for 15 years. The angle was impossible, as if someone was standing directly next to the bed, looking down. Even more disturbing was the date and time. The photo had been taken less than 10 minutes ago. My God, Sophia whispered, looking over her shoulder. How is this possible? Before Ethan could respond, the phone vibrated again. This time a text message, also from an unknown number. I choose those who have already betrayed. As you have. One by one, as you did. The closest ones first. The most loved ones second. Until only you are left. As you deserve. The words flashed on the screen like little luminous wounds, and beneath them, a last line that made Ethan drop. The phone from his shaking hands. Tonight she dreams of me, tomorrow she will see me. The next day she will be mine, as you will be. The morning brought rain, not the gentle tropical precipitation they had become accustomed to, but a raging storm that lashed at the hotel windows like impatient fingers trying to get inside. Ethan watched the deluge from his room, phone still, in his hand after his 10th failed attempt to call Claire. Each call went directly to voicemail, increasing his despair. The threat of the night message echoed incessantly in his mind. Tonight she dreams of me. Tomorrow she will see me. The next day she will be mine. Powerlessness consumed him, separated by continents and oceans from the woman who, despite all her betrayals, was still the center of his world. A world that was now crumbling around him like a sandcastle beneath the rising tide. 3 urgent knocks on the door interrupted his dark thoughts. Sophia walked in before she could even respond. Her wet hair dripping onto the carpet, her face marked by a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door and quickly checking to make sure it was locked. "About Miguel." She deposited a laptop on the table, opening it to reveal a series of security camera images. "I asked the hotel manager to check the recordings after I left you at the bar last night. He said it was to look for evidence about Carlos's disappearance." The images showed the hotel corridors, with time markers in the bottom corner. "Look at this. 3 in the morning. She pressed play on one of the videos. In the grainy black and white recording, Miguel walked slowly down the empty hallway, his posture strangely rigid, movements mechanical like a poorly manipulated puppet. He stopped precisely in front of Ethan's bedroom door, remaining completely still for almost 5 minutes, just watching, his head tilted at a slightly unnatural angle. Then, slowly, he brought his face closer to the door, as if he were smelling it. Listening? It was impossible to say. "That's not all," Sophia continued, moving on to another video. "Here he is at 4:17 in his room." The recording showed Miguel in his own room, kneeling in the center of the carpet, drawing something on the floor in what appeared to be his own blood. The movements precise and deliberate like those of an experienced artist completing a masterpiece. "I went to his room this morning," Sophia said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The maid was hysterical. Miguel isn't there, but he left this." She slid her phone across the table, showing photographs she had taken. The room's carpet was covered with complex symbols drawn in dark red, forming a circular pattern that bore a disturbing resemblance to the symbols they had seen on old documents in the library and in Professor Alvarez's office. In the exact center of the circle, written in capital letters that seemed strangely childish, "He comes to Barranco, as promised." Ethan felt his stomach contract painfully. The ravine where Carlos had disappeared. La Correra. "That's not all," Sophia continued, her finger sliding to the next photo, the image of Miguel's bathroom mirror where something had been written in red lipstick. Ethan immediately recognized Claire's phone number, followed by a single word. Next, his entire body turned cold, as if his blood had been replaced with ice water. "I tried calling the police," Sophia said, putting the phone away. "They're not interested. They say adults go missing all the time, especially tour guides who may have decided to abandon troublesome groups. I tried the American embassy again, but the storm knocked out lines of communication. We're stuck here until at least tomorrow." A silent notification lit up Ethan's phone screen, making him jump. A text message from an unknown number containing only GPS coordinates and 2 words, "Come alone." Sophia watched his pale face. What it was? He considered lying, out of habit, but found he no longer had the energy for it. Silently he handed her the phone. His eyes widened as he read the message. "You can't be considering going," she said, incredulity evident in her voice. "It's a trap, Ethan. Whatever is using Miguel, whatever Siguanaba is, it wants you there, alone, vulnerable." "And what do you suggest as an alternative?" he asked, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "Continue hiding here while this thing goes after Claire? While Miguel suffers whatever he's suffering?" He stood up, walking to the window, to watch the storm that seemed to intensify by the minute. "Besides, I don't think I have a choice. This thing will find me no matter where I hide. You saw what happened to Javier. He bit into a religious medal and survived, but he's still being hunted. He still sees her. He's still haunted." His hands balled into involuntary fists. "At least this way I face it on my terms. And maybe I can negotiate. Offer something in exchange for Claire, for Miguel." Sophia's eyes filled with unshed tears. "You're talking about sacrificing yourself," she said, not as a question, but as an observation. Ethan didn't deny it. "If it works, if it can save Claire, it would be worth it." And he realized with surprise that he was telling the truth. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since their marriage vows had left their lips, he wasn't lying. "I at least have to try. I owe it to her. I owe it to everyone I've hurt." "Then I'll go with you," Sophia declared firmly, her chin lifted in determination. Ethan shook his head slowly. "The message says come alone. Besides, you know this isn't about you. This thing doesn't want you. It wants me." His eyes met hers. "But I need you to do something for me. Something important." He grabbed a small notebook from the table and began writing frantically, tearing out pages and handing them to her. When I don't get back, send this to Claire. It's her parents' address in Seattle. That's where she'll probably go. And this is for my editor in New York. All the footage, all the evidence we've collected. Maybe someone can use this to understand what's going on, to stop it from happening again." Sophia accepted the papers with shaking hands, folding them and placing them carefully in her jacket pocket. The sun was already starting to set when Ethan drove the rented Jeep down the muddy road that led to La Carrera. The storm had abated briefly, turning into a persistent drizzle that reduced visibility and made the road treacherous. The coordinates on the GPS guided him to a different area of the canyon than the one where Carlos had disappeared. More isolated, wilder, where the vegetation grew thick and untouched right to the edges of the cliff. His heart hammered against his ribs as he parked the vehicle, leaving the keys in the ignition like a silent offering to no one in particular. The air was saturated with that same sweet metallic smell that I had noticed before, rotting flowers, and something that resembled blood. This time, however, it was more intense, as if the source was very close. The path to the exact spot was narrow and dangerous, requiring him to cling to exposed roots and slippery rocks to maintain his balance. A part of his mind absurdly registered that, even without supernatural intervention, this place was dangerous enough to justify countless accidental deaths over the years. Perhaps that was why Siguanaba had chosen it as its territory. Nature had already prepared the perfect stage for its manifestations. When he finally reached the small clearing indicated by the coordinates, the darkness had already descended almost completely, making it necessary to activate the flashlight on his cell phone to see the path. What he saw made his blood run cold. The exact center of the clearing, facing away from him, stood a female figure in a white dress that seemed to shine with its own light in the gathering darkness. Long black hair cascaded down her back until it almost touched the ground, moving gently even though there was no noticeable breeze. She was perfectly still, like a statue, her arms hanging relaxed at her sides. A few feet away, Ethan noticed something on the ground, a metallic object that faintly reflected the light from his flashlight. Narrowing his eyes, he recognized Carlos's camera, carefully positioned as if it were a gift left for him to find. "I know why you're here," Ethan said, his voice sounding strangely calm despite the terror pulsing through his veins. "I know what you seek. Revenge, justice, punishment for men like me." The figure did not respond, did not show any sign that he had heard, remaining completely still. "I'm here voluntarily," he continued, taking a cautious step forward. "I'm not going to run, I'm not going to fight, but I ask only one thing. Leave Claire alone. Leave her out of this. She's innocent. The only person who has done anything wrong is me." No response yet. With every fiber of his being screaming to run in the opposite direction, Ethan forced himself to take another step forward, and another. Now he was only 3 meters away from the figure. Up close, I could see disturbing details. The dress didn't seem to be made of normal fabric, but of something more fluid, almost alive, that undulated subtly as if responding to invisible currents. The hair, seen up close, was too perfect, too uniform in its absolute blackness, as if each strand were made not of keratin, but of solidified darkness. "Lucia?" he called hesitantly, even though he knew in his core it wasn't her. Not really, not anymore. Or should I call her Siguanaba? The use of the old name seemed to have some effect. The figure moved slightly, its head tilting as if listening to something far away. Slowly, he began to turn around. Ethan froze, his heart nearly stopping, in his chest. The white dress twirled gracefully, the black hair swaying like silk curtains. As she was almost in profile, about to reveal her face, a sudden violent bolt of lightning slashed across the sky, followed instantly by a deafening thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. As if on cue, the storm returned with vengeful force. Not normal rain, but something that seemed almost solid, heavy, painful drops that struck like small projectiles. The wind howled through the trees with an almost human voice, ripping branches and throwing debris. The sudden force of the storm pushed Ethan back, forcing him to shield his eyes from the lashing rain. When he managed to look again, the figure had turned completely around, but the darkness and the curtain of rain made it impossible to clearly make out his face. Only a glimpse was possible, enough to see that where there should have been human features, there was something fundamentally wrong. Impossible proportions, eyes too large and incorrectly positioned, a mouth that extended far beyond the limits of what any human anatomy would allow. The primal terror that partial glimpse unleashed was so intense that Ethan involuntarily backed away, losing his balance on the now soaked ground. It fell heavily, rolling dangerously close to the canyon's edge. When he managed to steady himself and look back at the clearing, the figure had disappeared. But in the exact place where he had been, there was now Miguel, or something using Miguel's body. His former guide smiled that impossible smile, his mouth stretched beyond human limits, his eyes reflecting the light of lightning like those of a nocturnal predator. "She likes you," Miguel said, his voice a disturbing mixture of his familiar tone and something else. A chorus of voices speaking in unison through his throat. "He sees potential in you, like he saw in me a long time ago." He took a step forward, moving with an unnatural grace, as if his joints worked differently now. "It's not the end, Ethan Morgan. It's just the beginning of your transformation. Soon, you'll understand. Soon, you'll see with new eyes. Another flash of lightning illuminated the clearing, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan saw not Miguel's face, but something superimposed on it, the same partially equine face he had glimpsed on the female figure, as if two realities were occupying the same space simultaneously. "What do you want from me?" shouted Ethan above the howl of the storm, his clothes now completely soaked, his body shaking uncontrollably. Miguel, or what was left of him, tilted his head at an impossible angle, his smile widening even further. "Isn't it obvious?" replied the multiple voice. "We want you to become part of us. Like Miguel, like Carlos, like everyone else before them. Punishment isn't death, Ethan. It's transformation. It's revelation. It's becoming what you always were inside." He opened his arms in an almost religious gesture of welcome. "She is waiting for you at the bottom of the ravine. Go to her willingly, and the others will be spared. Resist, and she will take everyone you love, one by one, until there is nothing left but you and your guilt." A peripheral movement caught Ethan's attention. On the opposite edge of the canyon, partially visible through the curtain of rain, a female figure surveyed the scene. Even from a distance, he immediately recognized Claire. But it couldn't be Claire. She was in California, thousands of miles away. And yet, there she was, watching him with an expression impossible to decipher through the storm. "Choose, Ethan." "Morgan?" Miguel's multiple voice whispered, now somehow audible just above the roar of the storm. "Choose who lives and who transforms." In some way that Ethan couldn't fully explain, he had survived the encounter in the ravine. The storm had reached biblical proportions, with lightning striking so close together that the ozone made the air almost solid. Amidst the chaos of the elements, Miguel, or the thing wearing his body, had disappeared, vanishing like smoke in the pouring rain. Claire's appearance on the other side of the canyon was also gone, leaving Ethan unsure whether it was real or a terror-induced hallucination. Staggering through the mud, almost blinded by the water falling from the sky, he had managed to find his way back to the jeep and drive to the hotel, his hands shaking so violently he could barely control the steering wheel. Now, wrapped in dry clothes but with an internal cold that no heat seemed capable of dispelling, Ethan stared at the documents that Sophia had spread out on the table in his room. After her choppy account of the encounter, she had briefly disappeared, returning with a file folder that she had somehow borrowed from Professor Alvarez's office during her visit. "He doesn't know I took this," she admitted, opening the folder. "But after Carlos disappeared, I realized we needed more information than he was willing to share. The documents were ancient, some in archaic Spanish, others in Mayan dialects that neither could fully decipher. But the illustrations were disturbingly clear even across language barriers. This is a text from the colonial period," Sophia explained, pointing to a yellowed manuscript with faded handwriting. A Dominican friar documenting rituals he discovered being practiced secretly even after forced Christianization. The page showed drawings of human figures gathered around a precipice, while a partially visible female entity hovered over them. "What was thought to be simply folklore has roots in very real cults," she continued, turning the page to reveal detailed illustrations of ritual symbols, the same symbols they had found in Miguel's room. "According to these texts, the Siguanaba is not a ghost or demon in the Christian sense. It is a manifestation, a physical embodiment of an abstract concept: marital betrayal, the breaking of sacred promises, the violation of trust." Ethan looked over the documents with shaking hands, his mind struggling to process the implications. How can something abstract become physical? Touch me? Hurt people? Sophia turned several pages forward, revealing an intricate diagram that vaguely resembled a human uterus, but with veins and arteries extending outward like roots, connecting to small human figures. The belief was that certain concepts, if fed with enough human emotion and energy over centuries, could develop a kind of independent consciousness, not alive in the biological sense, but awakened. She hesitated, as if weighing her next words, and what awakens needs to feed to continue existing. At that moment, Ethan's phone vibrated violently on the table. Claire's name flashed on the screen, sending a wave of relief and terror simultaneously through his body. He answered immediately, putting it on speakerphone. "Claire? Claire, are you okay?" The voice on the other end was tense, barely audible, as if she was speaking as quietly as possible. "Ethan, there's someone at our house." The words fell like stones in the silence of the room. "I arrived an hour ago. I came to get some things, and I heard movement upstairs. I thought it was thieves, but..." His voice trailed off momentarily. "Ethan, whoever you are is walking just like you. I'd recognize your walk anywhere. And he's whispering my name with your voice." Ethan's blood ran cold in his veins. "Claire, listen very carefully. You need to get out of there now. Don't try to see who it is. Don't be confrontational. Just leave through the nearest door and go to a public place." A tense silence on the other side. "Claire!" A strange sound came through the connection, a soft sound like hair sliding against the microphone. When Claire spoke again, her voice was different, lower, more melodic, with an ethereal quality that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. "Too late, love. She's already downstairs." A soft click, and the call dropped. Ethan froze, the phone still pressed to his ear, hearing only the buzz of the dead line. "I need to go back," he murmured finally, standing up with mechanical movements as if his body were operating independently of his shocked mind. "I need to get to Claire." Sophia watched him with a strange expression. Not exactly sympathy or concern, but something more calculating. "The next flight connection doesn't leave until the day after tomorrow," she reminded, her voice strangely monotone. "And even if you could get there instantly, what would you do? Face something you don't even fully understand?" There was something different about the way she spoke, the way she held herself perfectly still in her chair. Ethan felt the first alarm ring vibrating in his mind. "I'm going to call the LAPD," he said, reaching for the phone again. Before he could dial, however, Sophia spoke again. "Do you think the police can protect you from something like that? From something that can cross continents? That can be in multiple places simultaneously?" Her eyes met his, and Ethan realized with dawning horror that she hadn't blinked once since entering the room. Something that is already here, in this room, at this moment. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the soft pitter-patter of rain against the windows and the racing pulse of blood in Ethan's ears. "What do you mean?" he asked finally, his voice little more than a whisper. In response, Sophia just smiled, a slow smile that gradually extended beyond what was anatomically possible, revealing perfectly white, even teeth, except for upper canines that were slightly longer and more pointed than normal. "When was the last time you spoke to Lucia?" she asked, still with that impossible smile. An alarm sounded in Ethan's mind. "Yesterday," he lied automatically, "at the cafe." Sophia tilted her head at a slightly unnatural angle, like a curious bird. "Liar," she whispered, the words stretching out like poisoned honey. "Always lying, even now, even after everything." Her eyes never left his, never blinked. Lucia disappeared 3 days ago. No one has seen her since that night we received the first coordinates. No one, except you. In the cafe. The smile grew even wider. But it wasn't her, was it? It never was her. Just as it isn't me now. Ethan's survival instinct finally overcame the paralyzing shock. With a sudden movement, he grabbed the Jeep keys from the table and backed toward the door. Sophia, or whatever was using her body, remained seated, watching him with that fixed, inhuman gaze. "There's no point in running," she said, her voice now an unsettling mix of the familiar Sophia and something older, multiple. "Not for you. Not anymore." The original Tiwanet may have been just a punished priestess, a vengeful spirit bound by rules. But thousands of years of belief, of fear, of sacrifice, turned her into something more. His eyes seemed to darken, the pupils expanding until barely any white was visible. She has transcended. She has become a living principle of cosmic justice. And now, she is coming for you. Ethan turned the handle, but the door didn't budge. Locked, although he didn't remember hearing the bolt click. Sophia stood up with an unnatural fluidity, as if she didn't need her normal joints to move. Ethan Morgan, unfaithful husband, compulsive liar, serial cheater. Every word was an accusation, spoken by a voice that now seemed to contain multitudes. Do you think you can escape what you built with your own hands? Your guilt has a smell, a taste. It feeds us. It makes us stronger. One step towards him, then another. Your wife, your lover, your cameraman, your guide. Your sins have given us access to them all. And now to you. With a strength born of pure terror, Ethan threw his body weight against the door. The wood gave way with a shattering of splinters, throwing him into the empty hallway. He didn't look back as he ran toward the stairs, Sophia's, footsteps echoing behind him at a pace that seemed too fast, too fluid for human legs. Stumbling down the steps, he emerged into the nearly deserted hotel lobby at that time of night. The sleepy receptionist looked up briefly before returning to his magazine, apparently oblivious to the terror on Ethan's face, or the sounds of footsteps on the stairs behind him. The parking lot was flooded by continuous rain, turning the asphalt into a black mirror that reflected the hotel's distorted lights. Ethan dove into the Jeep, his hands shaking so violently that it took him 3 tries to insert the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as a figure emerged through the hotel doors. Sophia, walking calmly in the pouring rain, her face a study in inhuman serenity as she watched the vehicle pull away. The rearview mirror, Ethan saw his reflection fading. But somehow, even from a distance, he could feel those eyes fixed on him, like invisible anchors trying to pull him back. With no clear destination, he drove frantically along the country roads, his windshield wipers fighting futilely against the deluge. Every shadow on the roadside seemed to take the form of a female figure watching. Each momentary reflection in the fogged glass suggested a distorted face, half human, half equine. Panic made his breathing shallow, dark spots dancing in the periphery of his vision. It was when his phone vibrated in the passenger seat that he almost lost control of the vehicle, skidding dangerously close to the edge of the raised road. The number on the screen was unknown, but something, intuition, desperation, or simply the human need for connection in moments of absolute terror, compelled him to answer. "Ethan?" Claire's voice, clear and familiar, sent a wave of relief so intense that involuntary tears welled in his eyes. "Claire, are you okay? What happened?" Where are you?" The questions stumbled over each other in their rush to escape. A short silence before she responded. "I'm in Guatemala, Ethan. I came to find you." The words fell like stones into his stomach. "What? No. It can't be. You were in Los Angeles. You just called me from our house." Claire's soft laugh sounded strangely melodious through the connection. "That wasn't me on the phone, love. Just like it's not me now." Before he could process that statement, she continued, "I need you to come find me, Ethan. I'm near the Motagua River. You know where it is. Where it all started." The familiarity of the voice conflicted brutally with the impossible content of the words. "You're not Claire," he managed to say finally, his throat tight with fear. "What did you do to her? Where is she?" Another melodious laugh, now with a slightly distorted quality, as if several voices were laughing in unison, slightly out of sync. "She's safe, and for now. If you want her to stay that way, come to the river, alone now." A strange noise came through the line, something between a sigh and a hiss, like wind passing through dry leaves. "I didn't want it to be like this. You know, I prefer it when they come voluntarily, when they recognize their worthiness, but you're stubborn, Ethan Morgan. Persistently blind to your own faults." The voice changed subtly, becoming more reverberant, with a quality that seemed to fill not just his ears but his entire skull. "Maybe I needed more encouragement, something more personal." "Leave Claire out of this," Ethan pleaded. The vehicle now practically stopped in the middle of the deserted road, the engine barely murmuring under the roar of the storm. "It's me you want, always has been. I will. Just don't hurt her." A long silence followed, filled only by the patter of rain on the roof of the Jeep and his own ragged breathing. When the voice spoke again, it was no longer Claire's, nor any recognizable human voice. It was deep and ancient, multiple and singular simultaneously, as if a choir of beings spoke in perfect harmony. "You think you understand what's happening, but you don't. It's not about punishment, Ethan Morgan. It's about revelation. It's about transformation." Static rose on the line, as if the connection was rapidly deteriorating. Between the chirps, the voice continued. "For millennia I have shown men their true faces, revealed what is already within them. Those who flee I pursue, those who resist I break, but those who accept, those who come willingly, become part of something greater. They become messengers, heralds, like Michael, like Carlos." The tone changed slightly, becoming almost seductive. "As you could be." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, even though he knew he shouldn't engage, that every word exchanged with this entity was like diving deeper into quicksand. The answer came with disturbing clarity through the rising static. "You think I'm a monster, that I turn men into freaks, but don't you see? What I reveal has always been there, hidden beneath human skin. The deceit, the duplicity, the ability to wear different masks for different people. A sound that could be interpreted as a soft D. You are already a master of transformation, Ethan Morgan. Every lie, every betrayal was a step in your metamorphosis. I just complete the process." The terrifying clarity of these words hit Ethan like a physical blow. There was a perverse logic, a horrible truth that resonated deeply. He had lived for decades wearing different masks. The devoted husband, the passionate lover, the devoted director, switching them so easily that he sometimes forgot what his real face was. Siguanaba was not creating a falsehood. It was exposing one that already existed. The realization made his hand drop from the phone, and he slid it into the passenger seat, his voice still audible through the speaker. "Come to the river, Ethan Morgan. Come see your true face reflected in the water. Come finish what you started the moment you made promises you never intended to keep." Through the fogged windshield, the distant lights of a bridge appeared in the darkness. The bridge over the Motagua River, where it all began, where they had made their first filming, where he first saw the impossible reflection in the water. Without consciously realizing it, he had driven exactly to the location indicated by the voice on the phone, as if his body had already made the choice that his mind was still resisting. The windshield wipers continued their hypnotic rhythm, momentarily revealing, between sweeps, a lone figure standing in the middle of the bridge. A woman in a white dress, black hair dancing in the storm, patiently waiting for her chosen herald. The storm had subsided abruptly, as if it had served its purpose. A surprisingly bright full moon emerged from scattered clouds, spilling silvery light over the soggy landscape. Ethan turned off the Jeep's engine about 100 yards from the bridge, his eyes fixed on the lone figure waiting in the center of the structure. Even from that distance, he immediately recognized Claire's familiar contours, her distinctive posture, the way her light brown hair framed her face, even the familiar gesture of tucking it behind her ear as she waited. Every detail was perfect, impeccable, an exact replica of the woman with whom he had shared 15 years of his life. And it was exactly this perfection that confirmed the deception, a presence that could not be there, but was. The mud sucked at his shoes as he walked across the sodden ground toward the river, whose surface now reflected the moon like a broken, black mirror. The sound of their footsteps on the wet ground seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that had followed the storm, as if all of nature was holding its breath. When he reached the shore, about 20 meters from the bridge, Claire's figure slowly turned to face him. Her face, illuminated by the moonlight, wore an expression of calm serenity that didn't fit the situation. No sign of confusion, fear, or surprise at being inexplicably in Guatemala, alone at night. "Ethan," she said, her voice carrying that same perfect familiarity but with an ethereal quality that sent shivers down his spine. "You came." She began to descend the bridge, moving with a fluid grace that resembled water more than human muscle and bone. Ethan remained motionless, his instincts screaming to run as his feet felt fused to the ground. "You're not Claire," he managed, his voice firmer than he expected. The figure smiled, a smile that was simultaneously Claire's and something else, something that didn't belong on that beloved face. "No?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "I know every inch of her body, every thought that ran through her mind, every tear she shed when you weren't looking." Now he was only 10 meters away from him, his approach measured and deliberate. "I know the name of the girl you slept with in Toronto during the 2014 documentary film festival. Jessica Reiner, the press coordinator. Claire suspected it, but you denied it so convincingly. One step closer. I know about the publisher in Berlin 2016, the photographer in Ciudad de Mexico 2018, the film student at Sundance 2020. Each name pronounced with impeccable precision, each infidelity unearthed like a corpse from a shallow grave. Ethan felt his legs give out, almost falling to his knees in the mud. How could I know? Some of these adventures had lasted hours, without witnesses, without traces. If the word escaped like a strangled sigh. The figure wearing Claire's face smiled again, this time with an almost compassionate quality. "Guilt, Ethan. Guilt leaves marks, scars on the soul that never truly heal. only are covered by new layers of lies. And those scars, I can see them, I can feel them, I can taste them. She was now only 5 meters away, close enough that he could see that her eyes, although still Claire's familiar greenish-brown, reflected the moonlight the wrong way, like the eyes of a nocturnal animal. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan asked. Every muscle in his body tense, prepared for an escape he knew would be futile. "Why torture me like this? Why not get it over with?" The figure stopped, expression subtly changing to something that could almost be interpreted as surprise. "Torture? No, Ethan, it's not torture, it's revelation. It's a gift." She reached a hand toward him, Claire's hand, perfectly replicated down to the small scar on her thumb from a cooking accident years ago. "You've lived behind masks for so long that you've forgotten your true face. I'm offering you the chance to finally be authentic. To eliminate the dissonance between what you show the world and what you really are." As he spoke, something changed in his appearance. Not a complete transformation, but a fluctuation, like one image superimposed on another. For a fleeting moment, Ethan glimpsed something behind Claire's face. Elongated features, eyes that were too big and incorrectly positioned, teeth that couldn't belong in any human mouth. Then, like a transmission returning to normal after momentary interference, his wife's familiar face returned. But now he had seen what was behind the mask, and the knowledge was like acid in his mind. "We're not so different, you and I, the way," creature continued, its voice now a disturbing mix, part Claire, part something much older. "We are both experts at putting on different faces for different audiences. The difference is that I accept my nature. I embrace it. You still hide behind justifications and rationalizations. Another step closer, now only 10 feet separating them. But there's no need to hide it anymore, Ethan. Not from me. Not from yourself." His smile widened a fraction beyond what was anatomically possible. "Come to me, willingly. Accept what has always been." Something broke inside Ethan at that moment. Some last defense, some final illusion that he could escape, that he could somehow fix what he had done. The entity's words carried a terrible truth that resonated in its depths. He had lived a life of deceit, not only deceiving Claire and her lovers, but also himself, convincing himself that his actions had no real consequences, that his lies were justifiable, that he somehow deserved both his marriage and his escapades. "You're right," he said finally, his voice little more than a whisper. "About everything. About me." He took a shaky step forward. "About what I deserve." The creature watched him with eyes that now pulsed between familiar and alien, its smile widening in anticipation. Another step, the distance between them now just a meter. "I'm not running anymore," Ethan continued. "Not from you, not from the truth. One last step, now close enough to touch." The creature extended its arms, almost in a welcoming hug, its face now switching more quickly between Claire and something else, like a television switching between two channels. "I accept what I am," Ethan said, closing his eyes. "And what I deserve." "Ethan, who is this woman?" The new voice coming from behind him froze time. Familiar, loved, scared, and unmistakably real. Ethan spun around, his heart almost stopping in his chest. There, about 50 feet away, illuminated by the flickering light of her cell phone, was Claire. The real Claire, with rumpled travel clothes, makeup smeared from crying, red, frightened eyes alternating between him and the creature behind him. "Claire," he whispered, his brain struggling to process the impossible. As "I caught a flight after you called," she explained, her voice shaking slightly. "You seem so troubled, so different. I thought maybe—" His voice trailed off, his eyes now fixed on the figure behind Ethan. "Who is this? Why does she look like me?" It was true. From Claire's perspective, she was looking at a mirror version of herself, an impossible doppelganger who smiled with an expression she had never formed on her own face. Ethan felt his blood freeze in his veins. He was trapped between them now, the real Claire in front of him, and behind him, the thing that wore her face like an ill-fitting mask. "Claire, you need to leave," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Now, run. Go back to the village, don't look back." But she didn't move, her eyes still fixed on the creature behind him. "Ethan," she said slowly, "what's going on? Who is she?" Before he could respond, a voice identical to Claire's sounded behind him. "She's not going anywhere, none of us are." Slowly, feeling like moving through thick water, Ethan turned again. The creature had advanced, now less than an arm's length away. Her face was a horrible mixture. The top half still Claire, but below the eyes, the skin stretched over an inhuman bone structure. The mouth now very wide, full of teeth that no human should have. "You came voluntarily," she said, her voice a mix of Claire's and something much older. "Accepted his fate." The eyes now completely transformed, large, oblique, with vertical pupils, fixed themselves on his. "But the ritual requires a witness, someone who will carry on the story, who will keep the warning alive." Her gaze passed him to settle on Claire. Who better than her? The most betrayed, the most injured, the one who most deserves to see her true face. With a movement too quick for human eyes to follow, the creature grabbed Ethan's arm. His touch was simultaneously icy and burning, like metal exposed to extreme cold. "Look at me, Ethan Morgan," he commanded, his voice now reverberating impossibly as if speaking from within a vast cave. "Look at what you are, what you always were." The transformation accelerated, Claire's face disintegrating like a wax mask under flames, revealing the entity's true form. What Ethan saw in that face, if it could even be called a face, would be impossible to describe later, even if he had the chance. It was simultaneously equine and insectoid, familiar, and completely alien, female and male and neither. It was the abyss staring back at him, as Nietzsche had warned so long ago. Claire's scream pierced the night, not of fear, Ethan realized with surprise, but of protective fury. She was running toward them, brandishing the only weapon she could find, her own cell phone, the flashlight still shining like a tiny star against the darkness. "Release him!" he shouted, his voice carrying years of untapped strength. The creature faltered momentarily, its attention divided, and in that instant, something happened that neither of them expected. The light from the cell phone hit Siguanaba's reflective eyes directly, in the same way that Sophia's flashlight had done to Miguel. The creature hissed, recoiling as if struck by acid, its fingers involuntarily releasing Ethan's arm. The moment of freedom was all he needed. He grabbed Claire by the hand and ran, not back to the jeep, which was too far away, but to the bridge which offered the only elevated path across the now rain-swollen river. Behind them, the creature quickly recovered, its hiss turning into a howl of rage that belonged in no earthly throat. "There's no way to escape," cried the multiple voice. "You are mine, Ethan Morgan, your blood, your soul, your essence, all rightfully mine, given freely through every betrayal, every lie." Dragging Claire across the bridge structure, Ethan knew the creature was right. There was no real escape. The jeep was too far away, and even if they managed to catch up, where would they go? The entity had demonstrated that it could be in multiple places simultaneously, that it could use others as extensions of itself. The bridge now seemed like a dead end, a place where they would be trapped with no option of escape. Halfway up the structure, Ethan stopped, turning to Claire, with desperate determination. "Claire, listen," he said, holding her shoulders. "You need to go, now. I'll make you late." Claire's eyes, those real eyes she knew so well, widened with understanding. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving you. Whatever that is, we can—" Ethan interrupted her, his voice urgent. "We can't. There is no us in this fight. She wants me. Only me. Because of what I did. Because of who I am." The words came out in a torrent, with no time for half-truths or evasions. "All the times you suspected, you were right. All of them. I was unfaithful more times than I can count. I lied to you for years. I betrayed your trust again and again." Tears were running freely down her face now. "And this thing, it is what comes for men like me. What has always come. For millennia." The silence that followed was deafening. Claire stared at him, her expression impossible to read through the tears that formed twin mirrors in both their eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm despite the emotion. "I already knew, Ethan. I always knew. Maybe not all the details, but enough." She touched his face gently. "And yet I'm here. What does that say about the two of us?" Behind them, the creature had reached the start of the bridge, advancing slowly now, like a confident predator that knows its prey is cornered. Ethan felt something shift inside him, not a sudden revelation, but a quiet acceptance of a truth, long denied. "You say we deserve better than that," he replied, turning to face the approaching entity. "We both deserve it." With a sudden movement, he pushed Claire to the opposite side of the bridge. "Run! Don't stop until you find someone, anyone. Tell them what happened. Keep the story alive." For a moment she hesitated, her face a mask of conflict. Then, with one last painful look, he nodded and ran, disappearing into the darkness on the other side. Alone now, Ethan deliberately walked toward the creature. She had stopped a few feet away, watching him with those inhuman eyes. "You let her go," he said, his voice now completely devoid of any resemblance to Claire's. "One last act of redemption?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "No. A first act of honesty. Of being who I really am, not who I pretended to be." He took another step towards her. "You were right about me. About my lies, my betrayals. About the darkness I carried for years." Another step. "But I was wrong about one crucial thing." The creature tilted its head, a grotesque parody of human curiosity. "And what would that be?" he asked, his voice now a chorus of whispers. Ethan smiled, a genuine, fearless smile for the first time in days. "You said that you and I look alike, that we both wear masks." He was now less than a meter away from her, close enough to feel the unnatural cold emanating from her form. "But there is a fundamental difference. I can change. I can choose. I can take off my masks. You are nothing but a mask. An empty shell filled with pain and revenge." The rage that contorted the creature's inhuman face was palpable like electricity in the air. "Insolent," she hissed, her hands, now clearly claws, reaching out to grab him. "After everything you've seen, you still dare to challenge? You still don't understand what I am, what I represent. Ethan remained firm, not backing down. "I understand completely. You are the mirror in which men like me see their true faces. The abyss that looks back." His smile remained calm and resigned. "And I'm tired of running away from what I see in that mirror." With a deliberate movement, Ethan took the last step forward, directly into the creature's outstretched arms. "I accept my fate," he said, his voice clear in the silent night. "But on my terms. Not as a terrified victim, but as someone who finally sees the truth." Siguanaba's claws enveloped him in a hug that was simultaneously intimate and alien. Her face, that thing that wasn't a face in any human sense of the word, came closer to his. "Come then, Ethan Morgan," whispered the multiple voice. "See your true face in the abyss." When their faces almost touched, Ethan did the one thing the creature hadn't expected. With a sudden movement, he grabbed her tightly and threw himself backwards off the bridge, taking her with him as he fell. For a surreal moment, they seemed to hover in the air, suspended between heaven and earth. The creature's eyes, so close to his own, displayed something that could almost be interpreted as respect. Then gravity claimed its rights, and they both fell toward the dark waters of the Motagua River far below. The impact never came, at least not the impact Ethan expected. Instead of the physical surface of the water, they seemed to pass through something else, a membrane, a divide between realities. The last thing his human eyes registered was the Siguanaba's face transforming once more, not into the monstrosity he had glimpsed before, but into something almost serene. As if, in the end, she too had found an unexpected truth in that last act of self-determination. Then the darkness swallowed him completely, and Ethan Morgan ceased to exist in the world as he knew it. 3 days later, Claire Morgan sat alone in a Guatemala City hotel room, Ethan's notebook open on her lap. The official searches had been superficial and quick. Yet another American tourist went missing in the treacherous waters of the Motagua River during the worst storm of the season. Case closed. Bodies were rarely found, the officer explained with bureaucratic indifference. The river had many secrets, many submerged caves. Sophia had disappeared completely, her hotel room found empty, with no sign of a struggle, just strange symbols drawn on the bathroom mirror that no one could decipher. Of Miguel and Carlos, no trace was ever found. The pages of the notebook were filled with Ethan's meticulous notes on the legend of the Siguanaba, historical details, witness accounts, theories about its nature and purpose. But in the last few pages, the tone changed. The handwriting became more erratic, the words more personal. It was almost a diary, or perhaps a confession. Claire was reading these pages for the 10th time, absorbing every word, as if they could somehow bring him back, or at least explain the inexplicable she had witnessed. "I think I understand now," he had written on the penultimate page. "It's not about punishment. It's about transformation. It's about revelation. What Siguanaba shows is not a lie or distortion. It is a fundamental truth that we refuse to see in ourselves. The abyss does not create the darkness in our hearts. It only makes it visible, palpable, inescapable." The last entry, written the night before her disappearance, was even more disturbing. "Sometimes when I'm alone, I see my reflection change. Just for an instant, but it's enough. Something is growing inside me, something that has always been there, waiting. I'm no longer afraid, just curious. What will my real face look like when I finally look at myself in the mirror?" Claire closed the notebook slowly, her hands shaking slightly. As he did so, a small photograph fell from between the pages, an old Polaroid, yellowed with age. The image showed a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, smiling at the camera. Behind him, partially visible at the edge of the frame, was a woman in a white dress and long black hair, her face conveniently blurred by the movement. Ethan's handwriting on the back simply read, "Martin Thornwood, 1937, the first documentary filmmaker to attempt to film the legend of the Siguanaba." When looking at the photo, something strange happened to Claire's perception. For a moment, so brief that he easily chalked it up to exhaustion and trauma, the young man's face in the photo seemed to change, transforming into Ethan's, and the blurred figure behind him seemed to somehow look directly at her across time and space, with eyes that weren't human. Claire dropped the photo, her heart racing wildly. When he picked it up again, the image had returned to normal. Just an old photo of a stranger. That night, as she finally fell asleep after days of insomnia, Claire dreamed. In his dream, he was standing on the edge of a deep, dark river. On the opposite bank, a familiar figure waved at her, Ethan, smiling, like she hadn't seen him smile in years. "Come," he called, his voice simultaneously near and far. "The water isn't as cold as it looks." She would take a tentative step toward the water, then stop, uncertain. Something about his smile, something about the way his eyes reflected the moonlight wasn't quite right. "Claire," he called again, reaching toward her. "Come to me, I want to show my true face." And as she watched, fascinated and horrified, Ethan's face slowly began to change. Claire woke up gasping, the light of the Guatemalan dawn just beginning to filter through the hotel curtains. Beside the bed, his phone vibrated with a notification, a text message from an unknown number, containing only GPS coordinates and 2 words that made your blood run cold. "Come alone."